or otherwise known as Fluffypony, if anybody follows him on Twitter, or apparently people call him Fluffy anyway. So Riccardo is one of the lead maintainers of Monero. This is one of the coins in the privacy space, and he's recently become very involved in another, or co-founded, I think, another startup called Tari, and he's here to share some of his insights this evening. So thanks to Riccardo.
That's not me. That's me. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about privacy coins, so-called privacy coins. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Riccardo Spagni. I'm also known as Fluffypony on Twitter. That is a story for another time. I forgot to update the slides, so the stuff on the right you can ignore because that's not what I'm talking about. We'll just pretend that's what I'm talking about, I don't know. What I am going to talk a little bit about is why privacy matters, I think, as a soft intro. What I'm not going to talk about is tax evasion. Do your own research. But I want to start off by talking about how we're in a shifting landscape, or we've been in a shifting landscape for a long time, because at the beginning, early stages of commerce, we were very focused on using things that we could swap, and then cash money came out, and then we got things like checks and wire transfers, and then suddenly we could send money overseas without physically getting in a plane with a bag of cash or a bag of gold. And then like all this cool transaction switching came around, and then we got cool stuff like Apple Pay and Samsung Pay and insert name of whatever phone you have, yeah, Pay. And with that came a bunch of regulation like anti-money laundering and know your customer. And so what that's introduced is it's basically taken the burden of doing investigations and doing law enforcement, and it's taken it away from law enforcement agencies and put it on financial institutions. Because now it's their problem to figure out, oh, we've got a dodgy deposit here. This Fluffypony guy deposited 100,000 whatevers, and that's super dodgy. So, but at the same time, we can take our phone and we can tap it onto a machine and pay it. Isn't that cool? So what's really happened is we've had all this added convenience, and that's amazing, but we've lost privacy. And so this has kind of been like a boil a frog scenario. And those that don't know what boiling a frog is like, if you take a live frog and you put it in a pot of water that's boiling, the frog jumps out. But if you take a frog and you put it in a pot of cold water and then you bring that pot to boil, well, the frog's just going to happily swim around until, you have frog legs for dinner. And that's kind of what's happened to us. We've just sat around and we've just sacrificed our privacy as long as we can continue playing Farmville. And that's not been great. And the thing is, privacy is not just for criminals. I mean, it's for criminals as well, but it's not just for criminals. It's also for ordinary people, because we want to avoid advertisements that are based on our spending habits. I mean, it's bad enough that, we say something on WhatsApp and then suddenly we're getting adverts on Instagram for it. Or, we use Alexa and next minute, like, Amazon's like, well, we shipped milk to your house because you told someone that you were out of milk. This stuff's kind of frightening. I mean, yeah, it's convenient, but do we really want that? Targeted crime against the wealthy, that's a big one. We're seeing that happen more and more with cryptocurrencies, especially traceable cryptocurrencies, where people are, they're not even bragging about it. They're just making it obvious when they go to a cashier and they pay them using Bitcoin, and suddenly someone can perform wallet closure analysis and go, oh, that dude's got a lot of Bitcoin, we should take it. Unintended leaking of sorted purchases. No one really wants to know what you buy online. Or maybe some of them do. Unwitting complicity in criminal acts. Now this is a big one, because you might receive a little bit of money airdropped to you, and you don't know where that comes from, and you're like, whatever. And you spend it along with your normal Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, and next minute that money actually came from a drug dealer, and you're getting scooped up in a big drug raid because you must also be a drug dealer. Same goes for making donations. You make a donation to a particular organization, suddenly that donation is identifiable, and next minute your boss is firing you because you supported something that he doesn't agree with. It allows miner censorship based on recipients, so miners can censor transactions and go, well, we're not going to mine Riccardo's transactions because he calls himself Fluffypony rather, and who does that? It can reveal sensitive business relationships, like who your suppliers are, what your profit margins are, what people's salaries are. These are all things that come from a lack of financial privacy, and these are particularly relevant in cryptocurrencies where we don't even have the privacy protections that we have with a bank, which has a legal obligation to enforce some basic privacy. And so enter privacy coins, which of course everyone thinks are, you know, the next big thing, or the current big thing, or the whatever big thing, because transactional privacy is all the rage. The problem with this is you can't just claim, or you can actually just claim that your whatever coin is super private. It's the most anonymous coin. It also has instant transactions, and it can do 5 billion transactions a second. And these are claims that happen all the time, and people who are not heavily involved in this space just accept them at face value. Because how would you tell the difference? I mean, if I go to a mechanic and the mechanic says, well, sir, your is broken and we're going to have to replace that, and whilst we were replacing that, we noticed that it's also a bit wonky and it's going to cost you 20,000 Rand. I'm going to go, that's great, because I'm not a mechanic, nor should I be. And it's the same for people that are using these tools. They're not blockchain experts. They're, in fact, for the most part, they're not even developers. They're non-technical. And yet, some of them are relying on the privacy-preserving aspects of it for, you know, all sorts of things. Like they could be living in a country which has a government that is not too friendly and not too interested in your opinions on things, like China. So when it comes to identifying a cryptocurrency and whether a cryptocurrency is private or not, there are 5 aspects that I like to look at. And what we're going to do is take a look at these 5 aspects, see how Monero does it, and really give you a model that you can use to apply to other privacy coins or privacy-enhancing cryptocurrencies. So the first is something called unlinkability. And unlinkability means that the destination address that you're paying cannot be revealed. So if, for example, I have a Bitcoin address and I once posted it on a forum somewhere and then I received money to that, that is linked back to me. Similarly, if I receive money at a particular address on an exchange, that exchange knows who I am and is able to go and reveal that information on. So unlinkability is, do we obscure or hide or encrypt the destination where transactions are going to? Then untraceability is, do we hide where transactions are coming from? So if I receive money from an exchange or a drug dealer, is it possible to tell with absolute certainty where that money comes from? Then are we hiding transaction values? Because again, going back to that example of targeted crime, if nobody can see the transaction values, how can they target anyone? And then passively, is it passively hidden? So are we resisting attacks that are able to determine the originating IP address of a particular transaction? And then optionality, are we maximizing the privacy set? So let's take a look at how Monero does this. So let's start with being cryptographically unlinkable. Now, in Bitcoin and in many cryptocurrencies, you have inputs and outputs, and it's kind of like 2 sides of a transaction. And the inputs have to balance out with the outputs. So the inputs are the bits that you're spending, and the outputs are where they're going to. So how do we make them cryptographically unlinkable? Well, in Monero, we use something called dual key stealth addressing. And what that means is those little things on the right-hand side where it's like 9D3, blah, 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 all of those things are not Monero addresses. They're actually a dual key stealth address. So it's a destination that it's going to, which has no correlation with the address. And so in this example, where there are 3 different Monero outputs going to a recipient, and 3 Monero outputs coming back to me as change, what we see on the blockchain looks more like that. And now there's no way to tell which of these, if any, are coming back to me as change, which are going to recipients, who the recipients are, what their Monero addresses are. So this is how we achieve cryptographic unlinkability. And this is something that, from a cryptographic perspective, we consider absolute, because it's not something that can be broken easily. It's the equivalent of encryption. So how do we make it cryptographically untraceable? Now this really focuses on the input side. So where is the money coming from? And what we do is we pick a bunch of random transactions on the blockchain, and then we create this really cool thing called a ring signature. And basically a ring signature is like, imagine a bunch of people got together in a room and they all were involved in signing those. So now what happens is, because of the ring signature, you can't tell which of these was actually the true signer. We know that the one in red was, but to a passive observer, to somebody looking at the blockchain, there's no way they can tell. This little key image thing prevents me from going and spending that output again later on, but it doesn't allow anyone to deduce who the true spender was. However, the big issue here is in choosing those random outputs from the blockchain, because what we've observed is people have a tendency to receive money and spend it pretty rapidly. Now, if the outputs that we're choosing from the blockchain are over the course of the blockchain's history, well then, obviously the most recent one is more than likely the one that the guy's spending. So what we found, and this is something that we found very early on in Monero's history, is that this output selection thing is really hard. It's genuinely hard, and we consider this the weakest aspect of Monero's privacy, because you can make certain guesses. There are multiple weaknesses that have been discovered in our output selection algorithm by the Monero Research Lab over the course of Monero's early history, and even more recently, despite improvements, there have still been weaknesses that have been discovered. And the thing is, even though there's all sorts of work that's been done to improve this, it does provide you with something that is really, really powerful, and that is that you have plausible deniability. So even though someone can have a guess at which output in this block, in this ring signature, is the one that's really being spent, if somebody had to come knock on your door and say, we think it was you, you have plausible deniability because there's no proof. It's all guesswork. So this is still something that, whilst it needs constant improvement, and whilst everyone that's involved in Monero development is constantly trying to figure out what people's spending patterns are in order to improve this, it's still incredibly strong privacy and not something that is trivially broken, because you always have this plausible deniability. Now, when it comes to values, basically what we use is something called Peterson Commitments, which is a way of committing a cryptographic hash or cryptographic value to a numerical value without revealing what that value is. And so the upshot of which, without going into too much detail into how that works, is we end up with this on the blockchain, which is that you can't actually tell what the amounts are, but you are able to do a special type of cryptographic math to subtract the total number of outputs from the total amount of the inputs without knowing what these amounts are, just subtracting the commitments and going, okay, cool, these two balance out, so no new Monero was created other than N. Now, the last, or the fourth aspect is being passively hidden. Now, the way cryptocurrencies work is there are a bunch of nodes running all over the world, and what someone can do if they are a very powerful, very sophisticated, very motivated attacker is they can run a bunch of their own nodes, and these nodes can log every time they get a transaction. They can log the exact timestamp and the IP address of where that transaction originated from. And hopefully, if they have enough nodes, they will catch the first node that broadcast that IP or broadcast that transaction. Because the way transactions are broadcast is your node broadcasts it to its peers, the ones that it's connected to, and that then goes and rebroadcasts it onto others. So you can see in this example here, this naughty logging node is able to tell where it originated from because it happened to be connected to that node. This is a super hard attack to pull off. It requires a lot of resources. It requires you running thousands or even tens or hundreds of thousands of nodes all over the world on different C-class IP addresses and so on. And yet it is still something that we consider to be a plausible attack. So how do we defend against that? Well, the way we defend against that is by running an overlay network. So in this example, we're running an overlay network using Tor or ITP, using a hidden service system like that. And then when that transaction is broadcast, it's broadcast on the overlay network and not on the underlying network that's used for moving blocks around. The upshot of this is that all this logging node can see is this hidden service address, and it doesn't know the actual IP address of that node. And the last aspect is optionality. Now, optionality is the idea that a transaction can be private or it can be public. I've heard lots of arguments from what I like to think of as new age privacy coin proponents that say, oh, we need public transactions. Because public transactions are for people who are doing legitimate business, and then private transactions are obviously for criminals, or whatever they say. The reality is that anyone can make a transaction private, even on the most secure system, or the most private system in the world, just by going and taking a screenshot of their transaction and putting it on Facebook. Congratulations, you just revealed revealed details of your transaction. So, whoopsie, let's go back there. So the thing is, like, with a blockchain that's got 100,000 users, I should really not set that animation to do that. Even if you've got a magical cloud of privacy, the reality is that your anonymity set ends up getting restricted to the people that use that magical cloud of privacy. And that means that being private by default is very important. It doesn't mean that you can't have public transactions in Monero. It just means that all the transactions are private, and if you want to reveal the details of your transaction, no problem. You have many ways to do that. Monero gives you ways of cryptographically revealing those details, or you could literally just take a screenshot and put it up on Facebook. So, when it comes to evaluating privacy technology, on these 5 rules, or on these 5 baselines, like, what do we do? How do we evaluate it? So what I thought of doing is doing a little sample of evaluation. Now, oh wow, this is really sucky today. Woo. Let's try that again. Okay, so that's not going to work. At any rate, this sample evaluation, it's going to disappear in 3 seconds. Take a photo quickly. So what this really does is it gives us like a baseline for how to evaluate things, and it gives us these 5 points which we've gone over, and then you can say, okay, does this particular privacy coin do this? Does it make sure that we can't view amounts? And I mean, you could trivially go and validate that by going to a block explorer and seeing, oh, well, the amounts are visible. Or going and searching for your address on the block explorer, and if you can find it, well, then, you know, not so private. Similarly, stuff like Zcash, and I consider Zcash, or Zcash, I guess, a very powerful privacy-enhancing tool. The thing with Zcash, whatever cash, is that because transactions are not private by default, because they're not mandatorily private, you end up with this optionality which is hardly utilized. And that means that all of the really cool privacy-enhancing stuff that Zcash does is largely wasted because there are only a handful of people using it. And so that's why mandatory privacy is so important, because otherwise you just end up with like, well, all of the cool stuff is there, but it's optional. And then a final note on this is that ideology is as important as the technology behind it. And the thing to note here is that Monero contributors, I think, are pretty good in understanding these 4 things, which are just not going to stay up today. Which is that, firstly, Monero contributors know that at the very least the code that we write is going to be responsible for people's money. We're also aware that the code that we write is probably going to be responsible for someone's life savings, because it doesn't matter how much you preach pragmatism and say to people, don't buy Monero unless you have a use for it, people are going to go and like put their house up on the market or do something stupid and invest it all and hope that it goes up. But we're also aware that our code might be responsible for a situation where if the privacy aspect of it fails, someone can go to prison. And that's kind of daunting. And the 4th thing is we're aware that the privacy-enhancing technology in Monero might be the difference between someone's life or death. And that's really frightening. I think it's something that, as contributors to a privacy-enhancing project, we always keep ever present in our mind. And so ideology is as important as the technology. If you have people who are building a privacy coin, but they're doing so because it's an ecosystem and they're going to, you know, make things simple for people and whatever, those are laudable goals. But if that's not their chief ideology, if that's not their chief aim, if their chief aim rather is that and not to protect users and not to defend privacy, then they're going to end up with privacy technology taking, well, a second class to, you know, usability and silly functionality that's largely unnecessary. So ideology is key. And on that note, maybe this slide will stay up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rick. Thank you. We're going to open up for questions. The first one's come through on Twitter to ask your views around quantum computing and what will happen in the blockchain space.
Sure, so quantum computing is interesting because currently quantum computers of sufficient power don't exist. And so there's a lot of really good guesswork that's being done as to what a post-quantum landscape will look like and what post-quantum cryptography, or how post-quantum cryptography should function. But the reality is we don't know. So it would be premature of projects to go and take something like super singular isogenies and slap that into their project and go, well, we're quantum safe. Because A, they're probably not quantum safe, and B, a lot of the claims as to the security of some of these cryptographic schemes is somewhat weak and might be broken by an ordinary GPU, even if it is quantum safe. So when it comes to quantum cryptography or post-quantum cryptography, we're largely taking a wait-and-see attitude, as I think of most of the more mature cryptocurrency developers. Wait and see, and as we get closer towards it, as quantum computers with sufficient qubits do come onto the scene, then we will start to have a baseline for comparison and go, oh, this is actually safe in a post-quantum world, and these are the effects in a post-quantum world.
Questions from the audience? Yes. All right, we'll start here, you next, I promise.
Are you familiar with Mimblewimble or Grin, and do you have an opinion on it?
Yes, so on that slide that didn't want to stay up, I had a little homework section at the bottom, and that was to go and evaluate on this basis things like Mimblewimble, things like Bitcoin, and if you're using things like Samurai wallets or joint markets. I love Mimblewimble from a scaling perspective. I am somewhat hesitant as to the privacy claims with Mimblewimble because a lot of it relies on, well, there's two aspects to it. There's, Mimblewimble or privacy in Mimblewimble as it applies to Grin, and then there's privacy that's inherent in Mimblewimble. And so there's privacy that's inherent in it, like it uses confidential transactions, so the values are hidden. That's great. And then there's transaction cut through. So as long as you don't have nodes that are sitting and logging all the transactions that are broadcast, which you obviously will have, then the actual thing that you see on the blockchain is pretty private. The issue is that those nodes that are sitting and logging transactions are less than ideal, and they are obviously going to exist because any privacy enhancing technology will automatically, by default, have people trying to attack it or weaken its privacy. So I think that there's a lot of improvement that can be done, and especially because by its nature, Mimblewimble requires interactivity, where with Monero you can build a transaction completely offline. And that interactivity is actually good because it means that you can do all sorts of cool privacy stuff the minute you need interactivity. But how that actually pans out in reality and whether it's resistant to liquidity attacks is something that I'm just taking a wait-and-see attitude for. But we're very excited in general about Mimblewimble, and in fact we're building Tari on a Mimblewimble base that acts as a Monero sidechain.
Hi, two questions if I made. Scaling, your thoughts on that? Those ring signatures look quite big. And then I've heard someone say that any cryptographic method has about a 20 to 30 year shelf life. Now, if you take that into account and you have a permanent ledger, which is private, then won't your privacy be in jeopardy in 20 to 30 years from now if you can go back onto the ledger and break that cryptographic method?
Cool, good question. So firstly, with respect to scaling, I think in part because of Monero's properties, scaling is very difficult, and so, or on-chain scaling is very difficult, and so I'm a big believer in layer 2 as a scaling mechanism. It doesn't mean that Lightning is the only thing that I'm interested in, but it does mean that that's the thing that I'm interested in right now. I'm also very interested in sidechains as a scaling mechanism, especially temporal sidechains, so sidechains that exist for a period of time, let's say 3 or 6 months, and then get turfed. Those are all things that I'm interested in because of Monero's properties. Similarly, and to answer the second question along the same lines, you're absolutely right. We have to have an expectation that all of the stuff will eventually be broken. And it's the same as something like TLS. And this is something that's possibly not widely known, but there are logging nodes or logging systems around the world that schnauf up all of the encrypted TLS data. And this is something that's come out from some of the NSA stuff that's been pushed out over the years. So we know that at least the NSA is doing it, and presumably there are other organizations that are as well. Why are they schnaufing up encrypted TLS data? Because they're acting under the assumption that at some point they'll be able to decrypt it. So even if you, I mean, the fact that we're handing it to them on a platter on a blockchain is interesting, but yeah, you have to have an expectation that this stuff's eventually going to be broken. So one of the things that Layer 2 gives us is it gives us an entirely separate system, and something like Lightning with the Tumblebit as a router on both ends would give us a temporal transaction that isn't necessarily even settled back onto the base layer at all in any way, shape, or form. And so that's really powerful because it means that even if they're looking at that base layer, all they're seeing are final settlement transactions, which might happen after a year or 2 years of transacting between parties. So I think that that's sort of where we're going to try and make just make it a bit harder for them for anyone to figure it out and to break it.
Hi. I'm actually heavily interested in the privacy of Monero. So I just want to know what's your opinion on China, because they're implementing a social credit score. So basically, the citizens there, this privacy is just gone. So if you plan on having a presence there, I know that the government there is not fond of cryptocurrencies, or do you have any other presence in an authoritarian government country?
Good questions. So Monero is completely self-organizing, so there's no central company or Monero Foundation or anything like that. There are Monero fans in China, and I know that Monero has a relatively big presence in Venezuela. I was chatting to a guy who lives in Venezuela a little while ago when I was in South America, and he said to me that some of the biggest users of Monero in Venezuela are the politicians. So, so clearly, you know, it's not just for criminals, it's also for politicians. And I think that's kind of interesting because it's done in a way, or it's used in a way there where it's largely untouchable by the government, because the way it's being acquired isn't even OTC. The way that they're acquiring Monero is buying graphics cards and then mining. Sometimes not even mining Monero, they're mining some other thing and then converting it to Monero and using that as a private store of value and a private medium of exchange. So I think in China as well, I think that's probably like where things will go. China is a very interesting place because the government is so authoritarian that they have this whole thing where if you go and buy a kitchen knife at a flea market, that flea market needs to have a machine that laser etches a QR code for your identity document, so that if that kitchen knife is ever used in a crime, they can go, ah yes, there is the QR code for Riccardo. He murdered this person with his kitchen knife. It's crazy. I mean, it's beyond belief. And these are the things that we're fighting against, because we're almost literally living in George Orwell's 1984 in China and in other places. Europe has just got cameras everywhere. And the only reason we don't have cameras all over the place here is because we can't afford them.
Rich, I'm going to send you to the back of the room if you don't mind. There's a question from Heidi. I don't have glasses on.
Hi, Riccardo. I think you and I need to go and have lots of wine and get drunk and debate Monero, because I'm like basically disagreeing with everything you just said. But that's a conversation for another time. So I'd like to pivot my question to something else that you're involved in, which is Globy. And my question is that obviously the point of Globy is to push merchant acceptance of cryptocurrency. And I wanted to get your opinion on what you think the biggest barriers are there, and why you think that's a good idea, like that we can pay for our copy with Monero.
Sure. So Globy isn't just focused on merchant acceptance, it's payment rails. So it's both sort of going crypto to crypto, fiat to crypto, and crypto back to fiat. And the reason is, I think that a circular economy of any size is going to take several decades to exist. And so in the meantime, we still keep having to dip our toe into the fiat world. So even if you're a person earning crypto and you get paid in Bitcoin or paid in Monero or paid in whatever, when it comes to every single expense in your life, 99% of them you have to pay in fiat. You're not going to go to your landlord and be like, well, actually, I'd like to pay you in Bitcoin, because your landlord's going to go, what? And so because of that, Globi is something, or is one of many companies that exists to try and bridge that gap. And what I'm hoping is, as we push things like, oh, well, you know, you're a crypto accepting merchant, you can now do payroll into fiat using Globi. As we start building technologies and systems out like that, then what we're eventually going to lead, to, is a circular economy that isn't reliant on crypto. It's a circular economy that can develop over time, where companies can say, well, I don't need a bank account. I'm only using crypto because I can do all of my payments, fiat payments, no problem. And then as the people that I have to pay, as my suppliers and service providers start accepting Bitcoin or accepting cryptocurrencies, well, then I can just switch to paying them that way instead of having to pay them in fiat. So it's really just to bridge those two worlds until such time as Globi works itself out of existence and it's no longer needed.
Okay, last question here, then we'll wrap up. Sorry, thanks, Krish.
Hello, Riccardo. Akona is my name. I work with the Department of Government Department. Interestingly, science and technology. You know, part of my role is to look into the emerging technologies and the areas where we still need to build some capabilities of skill. You know, my observation is that the 10,000-hour rule does not necessarily work in the space of the cryptos and blockchain. Maybe you can answer to that. But what advice can you give to government, to DST, looking into building capabilities in the country, given that the challenges we have and the universities currently don't offer what you guys have?
Sorry,
you know, because we're looking into possibilities of mentoring programs where mature developers can be able to get in some of the government programs and look into how do we develop skills, hackathons, and so forth. And by the way, congratulations for the online blockchain university. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, before you answer it, I wanted to, please, if you use this opportunity to speak about Tari, because I think it's, as a country, we're desperate for knowledge. It's an incredible thing.
Cool. So Tari is a project that I co-founded. We're building a decentralized assets protocol, and it's going to take us a long time, but its primary focus is on natively digital assets, both fungible and non-fungible. And so, you know, in-game tokens, in-game assets, ICO and STO tokens, tickets, what else? Digital collectibles, DRMs. There's all sorts of things that you can do using something like a decentralized assets protocol. And one of the things that we realized as we started down this road is we decided to build out the Tari Labs team, which is a group of contributors to this protocol. And we decided to build that team out in Johannesburg. And as we started hiring people, we realized that not only are there incredibly gifted developers and incredibly gifted academics in Johannesburg, but they largely have no exposure to this blockchain cryptocurrency world. So how do we bridge that gap? So the way we've done it is we formed this thing called Tari Labs University. And Tari Labs University is pushing out content all the time, and it's all open source, so anyone can come in, error check, you know, create a new Tari Labs University guide, do anything like that, you know, fix problems, open issues, whatever. And really just building a stable of content where people can go and say, oh, I want to learn about this, I want to learn about Mimblewimble, and then I want to learn about Grin versus Beam, the two big implementations. And I don't just want to learn about all the positive things, I want a pragmatic view. I want to know where the pain points are, where do they fall down, what are the failure modes. And so that's really what Tari Labs University is trying to just build the stable of content that is all-encompassing, from sort of relatively basic concepts through to extremely detailed, very deep, cryptographically topical aspects of blockchain development. To speak to your point, I think that as a country or from an education perspective, there's often this belief that the only real thing that's important is development, like software development, as respects blockchains, and that's not true. By and large, blockchains like Bitcoin and Monero are a delicate balance of incentives, game theory, economics, cryptography, and then of course software development as well. And even within software development, you've got defensive programming and test-driven design and all these different aspects of it. So yes, software development is definitely something that I think needs to be taught, but maths and logic and game theory are things that people can focus on, as well as things like economics. I mean, there's a whole new world of crypto economics out there, and you don't need to know anything about cryptography or about blockchain development in order to go and become an economist that is focused on that field. So I think that opening these different aspects up or encouraging people to focus on these different aspects is pretty critical. But I mean, they're in the STEM field, you know, so the focus has to be on STEM as a group and really pushing people into that. People who have a natural curiosity and who are interested and willing to learn. If they can focus on pretty much anything in the STEM field, then technology like blockchain development will become second nature to them.
Cool, thanks Rick. Thank you very much.